In the autumn of 1994, in a quiet community in Colorado, a young couple went missing under mysterious circumstances, and investigators had no answers. More than 2 decades later, a hidden clue came to light, and it exposed a dark secret. The city of Denver was experiencing a beautiful, crisp autumn. The summer heat had finally broken, leaving behind cool breezes and golden leaves falling across the quiet suburban neighborhoods. It was a season of change, and for 26-year-old Leo Sullivan and his 24-year-old wife, Audrey, it was supposed to be the beginning of a beautiful life together. The couple had just gotten married in late August, surrounded by their friends and family in a small, modest ceremony. They were deeply in love, balancing each other in a way that made everyone around them smile. Leo was a quiet, hardworking man. He worked as an auto mechanic at a local garage, coming home every evening with grease on his hands and a tired but genuine smile on his face. He was the kind of man who showed his love through acts of service, always making sure Audrey's car was running perfectly and fixing things around their small apartment before she even had to ask. Audrey was his exact opposite. She was a vibrant, endlessly energetic kindergarten teacher. She was loud, she laughed easily, and she wanted to remember absolutely everything. To capture their new life together, Audrey had purchased a bulky, heavy VHS camcorder. She carried the heavy black camera on her shoulder everywhere they went, filming their wedding, their quiet Sunday mornings, and Leo working in the garage. She loved pressing the record button and documenting their happiness. Because they were a young working couple, they couldn't afford an expensive, tropical honeymoon right after their wedding. Instead, Leo spent 6 months pouring his heart and soul into a secret project. He bought a broken-down, 1978 bright yellow camper van from a local scrapyard and restored it completely by hand. He rebuilt the engine, sewed new curtains for the windows, and polished the bright yellow paint until it shined like a mirror. When he finally surprised Audrey with it, she cried tears of absolute joy, filming the entire reveal on her VHS tape. They packed the van with heavy blankets, a small camp stove, and a cooler full of groceries, planning to spend 2 weeks driving through the breathtaking San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado. Their road trip began on Monday, October 10, 1994. The plan was simple. They were going to spend the week driving slowly through the winding mountain passes, camping under the stars, and eventually arriving at a beautiful, secluded rented cabin near a high-elevation lake by Friday evening. The cabin had a landline phone, and Audrey promised her mother, Patricia, that she would call the absolute second they walked through the door. For the first few days, the trip was a complete dream. Audrey called her mother from a payphone on Wednesday afternoon, her voice bubbling with excitement. She talked about the stunning golden aspen trees, the freezing, crisp mountain air, and how perfectly the yellow camper van was running. She told Patricia that she had already recorded hours of footage on her camcorder and couldn't wait to sit in the living room and show her the tapes. It was a warm, comforting, and perfectly normal conversation. There was absolutely no anxiety in Audrey's voice. There were no arguments, and there was no indication that anything was wrong. The last confirmed sighting of the Newlyweds occurred on Thursday afternoon, October 13. At around 3 o'clock, the bright yellow camper van pulled into a small, rural gas station near the edge of the dense national forest. The gas station attendant, a young man working the cash register, remembered them vividly. It was impossible to forget a bright yellow vintage van in a town filled with dark, muddy pickup trucks. He told police that Leo had pumped the gas while Audrey came inside to buy a cherry soda and a local highway map. The attendant noted that they were laughing and smiling. Leo even asked the young man for the best route to the lake where their rented cabin was located. They climbed back into the van, pulled out onto the quiet mountain highway, and drove toward the towering, snow-capped peaks in the distance. Friday evening arrived. Patricia sat in her quiet kitchen in Denver watching the clock on the wall. She had a notepad resting on the table, waiting for the phone to ring so she could write down the number of the cabin. But by 9 o'clock at night, The phone remained completely silent. Patricia felt a small, nagging flutter of worry in her chest, but she brushed it off. The mountains were incredibly isolated, and she reasoned that perhaps they had simply gotten a late start or decided to camp in the van for one more night before checking into the cabin. By Saturday morning, the silence had grown heavy and suffocating. Patricia paced the kitchen floor, dialing the number for the rental company that managed the lakeside cabin. When the property manager answered, Patricia's mild worry instantly morphed into a cold, terrifying dread. The manager checked the lockbox on the cabin door. The keys were still inside. The cabin was completely empty. Leo and Audrey had never arrived. Patricia immediately called the local county sheriff's department in the mountains. A missing persons report for 2 adults usually takes a day or two to generate any real urgency, but the isolated nature of the steep mountain passes changed the situation. A bright yellow camper van is incredibly easy to spot. If it wasn't on the road, it meant they had likely suffered a terrible accident, sliding off one of the dangerous, winding mountain cliffs into a deep ravine. The police launched a massive, coordinated search effort on Sunday morning. State Patrol helicopters flew low over the dense pine forests and the winding highway routes, scanning the steep drops for any sign of crushed yellow metal. Local deputies drove up and down the mountain passes, asking hikers and hunters if they had seen the couple. The story of the missing newlyweds broke on the local evening news, showing pictures of Leo and Audrey smiling on their wedding day. Patricia sat in her living room, weeping quietly, surrounded by friends and family who had absolutely no words of comfort to offer. It just didn't make sense. It really didn't. They were safe, responsible drivers, and Leo knew every single inch of that vehicle. For 3 agonizing days, the search yielded absolutely nothing. The massive Colorado mountains seemed to have completely swallowed the bright yellow van. Then, on the morning of Tuesday, October 18, a lone forest ranger was driving his patrol truck up a steep, rarely used maintenance road leading to a high-elevation scenic overlook. The overlook was mostly abandoned during the autumn months because the road was incredibly dangerous and prone to rock slides. It was miles away from the main highway, and completely in the opposite direction of the lakeside cabin Leo and Audrey were supposed to be traveling toward. As the ranger crested the steep hill, the heavy morning fog parted just enough for him to see something standing out violently against the gray rocks and dark green pine trees. Parked perfectly straight, resting quietly near the edge of the wooden guardrail, was the bright yellow camper van. The ranger immediately stopped his truck, grabbed his radio, and called for urgent backup, stating he had found the missing vehicle. He stepped out into the freezing, high-altitude wind and slowly approached the van. The engine was completely silent, and the hood was freezing cold to the touch, meaning the vehicle had been sitting there for days. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. The ranger peered through the driver's side window, cupping his hands over the glass to block the glare. The interior of the van looked completely normal at first glance. Leo's heavy jacket was draped over the back of the seat. The cooler was sitting on the floorboard. There was a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in foil resting on the dashboard, completely frozen by the cold mountain air. The doors were securely locked from the inside. But as the ranger looked closer, a terrifying chill ran down his spine. The heavy, bulky VHS camcorder that Audrey always carried was completely missing from the vehicle. Her purse was sitting on the floor, and Leo's wallet was tucked into the sun visor, but the camera was nowhere to be found. Within an hour, a team of county detectives arrived at the remote overlook. They used a specialized tool to unlock the van door without breaking the glass. The lead detective, a veteran named Thomas Sterling, carefully opened the driver's side door and began to inspect the interior. Almost immediately, Detective Sterling noticed a massive, glaring physical inconsistency that completely shattered the idea that Leo had parked the van at this overlook. The driver's seat was pushed violently backward, locked into the absolute furthest position on the metal track. Leo Sullivan was a modest 5 foot 8 inches tall. The detective realized instantly that Leo's feet could not have even touched the brake pedal from that position. Whoever had driven the yellow van up the treacherous mountain road and parked it at the overlook was an incredibly tall, heavily built person. Sterling's heart began to hammer in his chest as he turned his attention to the passenger seat. Resting perfectly flat on the fabric cushion was the local highway map Audrey had purchased at the gas station just days earlier. The map was heavily crumpled, as if someone had crushed it in a moment of pure panic. But it was what was drawn on the paper that made the detective's blood run cold. Leo and Audrey's original route to the lake was highlighted in yellow marker, but someone had taken a thick, blood-red marker and drawn a heavy, aggressive circle around an abandoned, deeply unpaved logging road nearly 50 miles away from the overlook. And written inside the red circle, in handwriting that absolutely did not belong to Leo or Audrey, were two terrifying words. "Help them." The terrifying words written in thick red marker completely paralyzed Detective Thomas Sterling. He stood in the freezing, high-altitude wind, staring down at the crumpled highway map resting on the passenger seat of the yellow camper van. Help them. It was not a plea written by a desperate victim. The handwriting was sharp, heavy, and incredibly steady. Combined with the driver's seat being pushed violently all the way back, a horrifying, undeniable narrative began to form in the detective's mind. Leo and Audrey had not parked the van at this remote scenic overlook. They had been intercepted. Someone incredibly tall and heavily built had taken control of their vehicle, driven it up this treacherous, rarely used maintenance road, locked the doors, and walked away. The map was a deliberate, taunting message left behind by a monster who felt completely in control of the situation. Sterling immediately grabbed his radio, shouting for the police dispatcher to mobilize every available tactical unit, search and rescue team, and K-9 unit in the county. The heavy red circle on the map was drawn around an abandoned, unpaved logging road nearly 50 miles away from the overlook. It was a rugged, heavily forested area known for deep ravines and dangerous wildlife. If the killer had left a map telling the police to help them, it meant Leo and Audrey might still be alive, trapped somewhere in that desolate stretch of wilderness. Within 2 hours, the abandoned logging road was swarming with law enforcement. Over 100 deputies and volunteers marched shoulder to shoulder through the dense, dark pine trees. State police helicopters flew dangerously low over the mountain canopy, using thermal imaging cameras to scan the freezing forest floor for any signs of body heat. Highly trained bloodhounds were given articles of Leo and Audrey's clothing from the impounded van, pulling their handlers desperately through the thick, thorny brush. Sterling personally led a team of officers deep into the treacherous ravines, slipping on the loose rocks and shouting the names of the missing newlyweds until his voice was entirely gone. They searched until the sun completely set, plunging the mountains into pitch-black darkness. They set up massive floodlights and continued searching through the freezing night. They searched for 3 exhausting, agonizing days. But they found absolutely nothing. There were no shreds of clothing torn on the bushes. There were no footprints in the mud. There was no freshly dug earth, no hidden camps, and no sign of Audrey's missing VHS camcorder. The bloodhounds just walked in circles, entirely unable to pick up a scent. As Detective Sterling stood in the middle of the empty, silent woods on the 3rd day of the search, a massive, sickening realization finally hit him. The red circle on the map was not a clue. It was a highly calculated, brilliant psychological decoy. The killer had drawn that circle and written those terrifying words specifically to send the entire police force 50 miles in the wrong direction. While hundreds of officers were wasting days searching an empty logging road, the killer had used that massive window of time to do whatever he wanted with Leo and Audrey, completely undetected. The task of delivering this horrifying news fell heavily on Detective Sterling. He drove down the mountain and made the long trip to Denver, pulling his unmarked cruiser up to Patricia's quiet suburban home. When Patricia opened her front door and saw the exhausted, heartbreaking look on the detective's face, she immediately knew her daughter had not been found. Sterling sat with Patricia in her living room, gently explaining the discovery of the yellow van, the pushed-back seat, and the cruel decoy map. He tried to keep his voice steady, but the seasoned detective was visibly shaken. Patricia did not scream, and she did not break down in hysterics. Instead, she just stared completely blankly at the wall, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt until her knuckles turned white. The profound, suffocating trauma of realizing her vibrant, beautiful daughter and her kind, hard-working son-in-law had been hunted by a sadistic predator was simply too massive for her mind to instantly process. Patricia slowly stood up, walked over to a small wooden table in the hallway, and picked up a framed wedding photograph of Leo and Audrey. She held the glass against her chest, closed her eyes, and finally let out a long, quiet, agonizing sob. Sterling sat in the living room, his own heart breaking, silently vowing that he would never stop looking for the monster who had destroyed this family. The investigation rapidly expanded, shifting from a search and rescue mission to a massive criminal manhunt. The police went back to the small, rural gas station where the couple had last been seen. They sat down with the young attendant, pressing him for any tiny detail he might have forgotten. The attendant was terrified and eager to help. He closed his eyes, desperately trying to replay the afternoon of October 13 in his mind. He remembered the bright yellow van. He remembered Audrey laughing. But when Sterling asked him if anyone else had been in the parking lot, the attendant hesitated. He slowly recalled a large, dark-colored utility truck parked near the air pump at the very edge of the lot. The truck was heavily covered in mud, making it impossible to read the license plate. The attendant remembered a man standing near the truck, smoking a cigarette and staring intently at the yellow camper van while Leo pumped the gas. Sterling leaned forward, his pulse racing, begging the young man for a physical description. But the attendant shook his head in deep frustration. The man had been wearing a heavy, dark winter coat and a pulled-down baseball cap. The only thing the attendant could definitively remember was the man's size. He was incredibly tall, easily over 6 feet 4 inches, with a massive, heavy build. It perfectly matched the physical profile of the person who had pushed the driver's seat of the van all the way back. The police immediately sent out statewide bulletins looking for a remarkably tall man driving a dark, muddy utility truck. They set up roadblocks, interviewed local hunters, and pulled the criminal records of every violent offender in the state matching that physical description. They interrogated drifters, questioned local mechanics, and scoured pawn shops across Colorado, hoping someone had tried to sell Audrey's heavy black VHS camcorder. But every single lead turned into a solid, unbreakable brick wall. The description of a tall man in a dark truck was simply too vague. There were thousands of utility trucks in the rural mountains. The killer had operated with terrifying, phantom-like precision. He had left no fingerprints in the van, no DNA, and no witnesses to the actual abduction. As November arrived, the brutal Colorado winter violently slammed into the San Juan Mountains. Massive, blinding blizzards buried the high-elevation passes in over 10 feet of heavy snow. The freezing temperatures and dangerous avalanches made it physically impossible for the police to continue searching the rugged terrain. Nature had completely sealed the crime scene, locking any remaining evidence under a permanent, freezing blanket of white. The investigation slowly and agonizingly ground to a halt. The national news stations eventually stopped calling. The missing person flyers taped to the windows of the mountain gas stations faded in the harsh winter sun and blew away in the wind. Leo and Audrey Sullivan became a tragic, haunting local legend, the happy newlyweds who drove into the mountains and simply vanished off the face of the earth. For Patricia, the passage of time was a unique kind of torture. She lived in the agonizing, suffocating limbo of ambiguous loss. Without a body, without a funeral, and without a single answer, her mind was never allowed to heal. She refused to move out of her Denver home, terrified that Audrey might somehow escape and try to call the house. She kept Audrey's childhood bedroom perfectly intact, leaving the porch light on every single night, just in case her daughter finally found her way back out of the dark. Years turned into decades. The world rapidly modernized, leaving 1994 far behind. The internet connected the globe, cellular phones became common, and the bulky VHS tapes of the past were replaced by tiny digital files. But Patricia remained entirely frozen in time. Her hair turned completely white, and her steps grew slow and heavy. Detective Thomas Sterling eventually reached the mandatory retirement age. He packed up his desk, handing his badge over to a younger generation of officers, but he never let the Sullivan case go. He kept a laminated copy of the cruel, red-circled highway map tucked safely inside his leather wallet. He would often drive his personal truck up to the remote scenic overlook where the yellow van was found, standing in the freezing wind, staring out at the vast, endless mountains, deeply haunted by his failure to bring the young couple home. 21 years passed. It was now the autumn of 2015. The missing newlyweds were entirely forgotten by the general public, existing only as a cold case file, gathering dust in the basement of the county sheriff's department. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. In late October of 2015, the State Park Service initiated a massive land clearing project deep in a heavily restricted, completely unpopulated sector of the San Juan National Forest. This specific area was nearly 80 miles away from the original search grid, far removed from the scenic overlook and the decoy logging road. The state had purchased a vast tract of private, deeply isolated mountain land from the estate of a reclusive local man who had recently passed away. The project required removing several old, rotting, and incredibly dangerous structures scattered across the newly acquired land. One of these structures was a deeply dilapidated, highly isolated hunting cabin sitting at the bottom of a steep, rocky ravine. The cabin had not been used in decades. The roof had completely caved in, and the wooden walls were severely warped and rotting from years of heavy snow and rain. A crew of 3 local contractors was hired to safely demolish the structure and haul the debris away. They arrived on a freezing Tuesday morning, carrying heavy sledgehammers and crowbars. The cabin smelled of damp rot and animal nests. As the men began smashing through the decaying wooden interior walls to weaken the structural supports, a loud, heavy metallic thud echoed through the dusty room. One of the contractors stopped swinging his hammer. He looked down at the wooden floorboards. When he had smashed through a thick section of drywall near the stone fireplace, something incredibly heavy had been dislodged from a dark cavity hidden deep inside the wall framing. It had fallen out of the insulation and crashed onto the floor. The contractor knelt down, using his gloved hands to wipe away 21 years of thick, gray dust and plaster. It was a bulky, heavy, black VHS camcorder. It was an archaic piece of technology, clearly from the early 90s. The plastic casing was heavily scratched and covered in dust, but it had been completely protected from the rain and snow because it was sealed inside the walls of the cabin. The contractor carefully picked it up, brushing the dirt away from the lens. He noticed a small piece of faded white tape stuck to the side of the camera. Written on the tape in faded blue ink were 2 words: Audrey's camera. The contractor, having lived in the county his entire life, felt a massive, electric shock run through his body as he remembered the legendary ghost story of the missing newlyweds. He didn't touch anything else. He immediately ran out of the rotting cabin, got into his truck, and drove directly to the county sheriff's department, carrying the dusty camera in his hands. The discovery sent an absolute earthquake through the cold case unit. The current lead investigator, a sharp, dedicated detective named Sarah Jenkins, immediately called Thomas Sterling, who was now a 70-year-old retired civilian. When Sterling walked into the precinct and saw the heavy black camcorder sitting in a plastic evidence bag on the table, tears instantly welled up in his tired eyes. It was the missing piece of the puzzle. It was the camera Audrey had carried everywhere she went. Detective Jenkins carefully put on a pair of latex gloves and pressed the heavy eject button on the side of the dusty machine. With a slow, mechanical whir, the tape deck popped open. Sitting safely inside the camera was a single, black VHS tape. The forensic technology team was completely terrified that the magnetic tape inside the plastic cassette had degraded over 21 years, but the dry, enclosed environment inside the cabin wall had miraculously preserved it. They carefully removed the tape, cleaned the spools, and placed it directly into a specialized, high-resolution digital conversion VCR in the department's media room. Detective Jenkins and Thomas Sterling stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark room, holding their breath as the technician pressed the play button. The screen flickered violently with white static for a few seconds. The audio crackled with a loud, hissing pop. And then the screen snapped into perfect, brilliant color. Audrey Sullivan's smiling, beautiful face filled the television screen. She was sitting in the passenger seat of the bright yellow camper van, laughing loudly as the wind blew her hair through the open window. The camera panned over to Leo, who was smiling and driving the van up a bright, sunlit mountain road. It was stunning, heartbreaking footage of a couple completely in love, enjoying the absolute best moments of their lives. Sterling watched the screen, his heart aching as he saw the victims completely alive and happy. The tape showed them pulling over to look at the trees, eating sandwiches on the hood of the van, and laughing about getting lost. But as the video progressed, the bright, sunny afternoon slowly faded into the dark shadows of the evening. The tone of the video suddenly and violently shifted. The screen cut to a new clip. The bright colors were gone, replaced by the grainy, low-light setting of the camcorder. The camera was no longer being held casually. It was resting on the dashboard of the camper van, pointing directly out the front windshield. The audio was no longer filled with laughter. Instead, the microphone picked up the sound of Audrey's panicked, heavy, terrified breathing. Through the windshield, illuminated only by the headlights of the yellow van, the camera recorded the dark, isolated mountain highway. And parked horizontally across the middle of the narrow, unpaved road, completely blocking their path forward, was a massive, dark-colored utility truck. Detective Jenkins and Thomas Sterling stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark media room, holding their breath as the digital conversion VCR played the 21-year-old footage. The beautiful, bright sunny afternoon on the screen slowly faded into the dark shadows of the evening. The tone of the video suddenly and violently shifted. The screen cut to a new clip. The bright colors were gone, replaced by the grainy, low-light setting of the camcorder. The camera was no longer being held casually. It was resting on the dashboard of the camper van, pointing directly out the front windshield. The audio was no longer filled with laughter. Instead, the microphone picked up the sound of Audrey's panicked, heavy, terrified breathing. Through the windshield, illuminated only by the headlights of the yellow van, the camera recorded the dark, isolated mountain highway. And parked horizontally across the middle of the narrow, unpaved road, completely blocking their path forward, was a massive, dark-colored utility truck. The truck's headlights were turned off, making it look like a massive, shadowy wall of metal in the middle of the forest. The audio captured Leo's voice from the driver's seat. He sounded nervous, but he was trying to remain calm for his wife. He told Audrey to lock her door and stay inside the van. He said he was just going to step out for a second to see if the driver of the truck had broken down and needed help. The grainy footage showed Leo opening his door and stepping out into the bright beams of the camper van's headlights. He raised his hand, offering a friendly wave, and called out into the darkness. For a few terrifying seconds, nothing happened. The forest was completely silent. Then the driver's side door of the dark utility truck swung open. A massive figure stepped out into the light. Sterling felt his chest tighten as he watched the screen. The man was a towering giant, wearing a heavy winter coat and a dark baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say a single word. He didn't ask for help. As he stepped fully into the headlights, the camera caught the dull, heavy glint of a massive steel wrench tightly gripped in his right hand. Leo instantly realized the danger. He raised both of his hands in the air, slowly backing away toward the van, telling the man to just take whatever he wanted. But the giant didn't slow down. He closed the distance with terrifying, explosive speed. The man swung the heavy steel wrench violently. Leo was struck hard and instantly collapsed out of the camera's field of view, falling into the dark gravel road. Inside the media room, Sterling closed his eyes, unable to watch the horror unfold. On the tape, Audrey let out a piercing, agonizing scream. The camera shook violently on the dashboard as she panicked, desperately reaching for the door locks or the ignition keys. The massive silhouette of the killer marched directly up to the passenger side of the yellow van. Without a second of hesitation, he raised the steel wrench and smashed it completely through the passenger window. The loud crash of shattering glass overwhelmed the microphone. A heavy, gloved hand reached through the broken window. The camcorder was violently knocked off the dashboard, tumbling down onto the floorboard of the van. The video screen went completely black. But the camcorder did not turn off. The microphone continued to record every single horrifying second of the audio. Sterling and Jenkins listened in absolute, suffocating silence as the tape recorded Audrey being dragged out of the van. She screamed Leo's name over and over again, her voice tearing with pure, primal terror. Then came the heavy, sickening sound of the two victims being thrown into the metal bed of the utility truck. A heavy metal tailgate slammed shut, echoing loudly into the freezing night air. Then the mountain road went completely silent. The only sound on the tape was the soft humming of the yellow camper van's engine. A few minutes later, heavy boots crunched against the gravel. The driver's door of the camper van opened, and the massive man climbed into the driver's seat. The microphone picked up the violent, grinding screech of the metal seat track as the giant pushed the driver's seat all the way back to accommodate his long legs. Sterling let out a heavy breath. This was the exact physical evidence that proved his 21-year-old theory. The killer had deliberately moved the seat. Next, the microphone captured a quiet, chilling sound. It was the distinct rustle of a paper map being unfolded. A second later, the sharp, highly recognizable squeak of a heavy felt-tip marker echoed on the tape. The killer was calmly sitting in the van, drawing the red circle on the map and writing the cruel message to send the police on a wild goose chase. When he was finished staging the fake crime scene, the man leaned down toward the floorboard. A massive, gloved hand filled the dark screen for a fraction of a second as he grabbed the camcorder. He pressed a button on the side of the machine, intending to turn the power completely off. But he made a crucial, history-altering mistake. Because the camera was already sitting in the dark, he didn't realize that he hadn't hit the power switch. He had accidentally hit the record button, stopping the tape, and then immediately hit it again, starting a brand new recording. The killer carried the camera out of the van and tossed it carelessly into the passenger seat of his own dark utility truck. The television screen in the media room suddenly flickered back to life. The camera was sitting upside down on the passenger seat of the killer's vehicle. The lens was pointed directly up at the truck's windshield. The video recorded the killer driving through the dark mountain passes for nearly 15 minutes. It was entirely too dark to see the driver's face, and the camera angle was too low to capture anything outside the windows. The only light source inside the truck cabin was the faint, glowing green light coming from the dashboard radio. But illuminated perfectly in that faint green glow, hanging directly from the truck's rearview mirror and swaying back and forth as the vehicle navigated the winding roads, was a heavy, plastic-coated parking permit. The camera recorded the swaying parking permit for 15 minutes before the heavy battery finally died, and the tape went permanently back to static. Detective Jenkins immediately paused the video, freezing the frame on the swaying plastic permit. The resolution of a 1994 VHS tape was incredibly poor. The text on the permit was heavily blurred, entirely unreadable to the naked eye. But they didn't need to read it right now. They just needed to know that a physical clue had been completely captured on tape. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Jenkins did not waste a single second. She securely packaged the fragile VHS tape into a heavy, shock-proof evidence case and shipped it overnight directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Advanced Digital Forensics Laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. She included a desperate, highly prioritized letter explaining that this tape was the key to solving a 21-year-old double homicide, and she needed their top technicians to pull the text from the plastic permit. For 3 agonizing weeks, Sterling and Jenkins waited. Sterling came into the precinct every single morning, sitting in a quiet corner of the office, drinking coffee and staring at the phone. He had waited 21 years for an answer, but these 3 weeks felt longer than the entire 2 decades combined. He was completely terrified that the FBI lab would call back and tell them the video degradation was too severe, that the pixels were too washed out to ever recover the text. Finally, on a quiet Thursday afternoon in late November, the phone on Jenkins's desk began to ring. It was the lead digital forensic analyst from Quantico. The analyst explained that it had taken their team hundreds of hours of painstaking, frame-by-frame digital stabilization to isolate the swaying parking permit. They had used advanced pixel enhancement software, slowly rebuilding the blurred edges of the letters using the green light from the dashboard radio to establish the contrast. The FBI sent a secure, encrypted email to Jenkins's computer. She clicked the link, and a high-resolution, digitally stabilized still frame of the VHS video popped up on her monitor. Sterling stood over her shoulder, holding his breath. The image was incredibly clear. The object hanging from the rearview mirror was a heavy, industrial gate access pass. Printed in bold, block letters across the top of the plastic card was a company name. It read, Pinecrest Stone Quarry Authorized Keyholder. And stamped heavily into the bottom corner of the pass was a specific employee identification number, tag number 42. Sterling let out a sharp gasp, slamming his hand down on the edge of the desk. They finally had him. The phantom predator who had completely outsmarted the police in 1994 had left his own personal identification tag hanging from his mirror. Jenkins immediately accessed the county's deeply archived business records. She searched for Pinecrest Stone Quarry. The results showed that the quarry was a massive, highly isolated deep-pit mining operation located deep in the San Juan Mountains. But the business had gone completely bankrupt and permanently closed its iron gates in the winter of 1992. The sprawling, dangerous property had been abandoned to the state. If the quarry had closed in 1992, it meant the killer was a former employee who still carried his authorized access pass in his truck 2 years later. Jenkins pulled the state employment ledgers from 1992, requesting the official employee roster for the Pinecrest Stone Quarry. She scanned the long list of names, moving her finger down the columns of heavy machinery operators, explosive technicians, and truck drivers. She was looking for the man assigned to tag number 42. Her finger stopped near the very bottom of the page. Tag number 42 was officially assigned to a heavy machinery foreman named Wallace Denton. Jenkins pulled the historical background check on Wallace Denton. The physical description sent a terrifying chill through the office. In 1994, Wallace Denton was 41 years old. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall, weighed nearly 300 pounds, and was known around the quarry as a brutal enforcer who handled violent labor disputes. He completely fit the gas station attendant's description of the massive giant smoking a cigarette near the muddy utility truck. But what terrified Jenkins the most was Wallace Denton's current status. Wallace Denton was not dead. He was not in prison, and he had not moved out of the state. He was now 62 years old, living completely off the grid in the deep mountains of Colorado. Jenkins pulled up the modern property maps for the county. She typed in the geographical coordinates of the rotting, abandoned hunting cabin, where the three contractors had just found the camcorder hidden inside the wall. The digital map zoomed in on a deeply isolated, heavily forested sector of the mountains. The rotting cabin sat at the very bottom of a steep, treacherous, rocky ravine. Jenkins highlighted the property lines surrounding the ravine. Sitting directly at the top of that exact same ridge, sharing a property line with the abandoned cabin, was a massive, privately owned, heavily fortified compound. The property was entirely surrounded by tall chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, entirely cut off from the main roads. The registered owner of that sprawling, fortified mountain compound was Wallace Denton. Sterling stared at the computer screen, a heavy, suffocating wave of dread washing over him. The killer had not just left the camera in a random cabin. He had taken Leo and Audrey's camcorder and hidden it in the walls of an abandoned structure sitting right in his own backyard, completely confident that no one would ever dare trespass on the land bordering his heavily guarded fortress. The police finally knew exactly who the monster was, and they knew exactly where he lived. But as Detective Jenkins looked closer at the satellite imagery of Wallace Denton's compound, she noticed a terrifying, undeniable detail about the land he had chosen to build his fortress on. The compound was built directly over the primary entrance of the abandoned Pinecrest stone quarry. Wallace Denton lived sitting directly on top of an endless, unmapped maze of deep, underground mining tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the earth. Detective Jenkins highlighted the property lines surrounding the deep, rocky ravine on her computer monitor. A heavy, suffocating wave of dread washed over the entire cold case unit. The dark, terrifying brilliance of the predator's plan was finally exposed. Wallace Denton had not simply dragged Leo and Audrey into the woods to hide their bodies. He had purchased a heavily fortified compound sitting directly on top of the primary entrance to the abandoned Pinecrest stone quarry. He had unrestricted, private access to an endless, unmapped labyrinth of deep-vein mining tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the Colorado mountains. He had taken the young newlyweds down into the absolute darkness of the earth. Detective Sterling stared at the glowing satellite imagery, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. The realization explained exactly why the massive, weeks-long search in 1994 had yielded absolutely zero physical evidence. The police had been searching the surface of the national forest, completely unaware that the victims had been swallowed by a subterranean fortress just miles away. Jenkins did not waste a single second. She immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the state police, and a highly specialized subterranean tactical rescue unit. Because Wallace Denton lived on a heavily fortified compound and had access to a massive underground mine, a standard police raid was completely out of the question. They were dealing with a massive, brutal man who knew the terrain perfectly and had spent 21 years preparing for this exact moment. The authorities needed to strike with overwhelming, paralyzing force. At 3 o'clock in the morning on a freezing Tuesday in November, a massive convoy of black tactical vehicles rolled silently up the treacherous, winding mountain highways. The Colorado sky was pitch black, and a heavy, blinding blizzard had just begun to fall, covering the steep roads in a slick layer of white snow. The tactical convoy operated in complete radio silence, their headlights turned off, using advanced night vision technology to navigate the deadly curves. They reached the perimeter of Wallace Denton's compound just before 4 in the morning. The property was a terrifying fortress. A 10-foot-high chain-link fence topped with thick coils of razor wire surrounded the entire estate. The lead tactical breacher gave a silent hand signal. A heavy, armored police transport vehicle accelerated violently, smashing directly through the heavy iron front gates of the compound. The massive crash echoed like a bomb detonation across the silent mountain. Dozens of heavily armed SWAT officers flooded the property, their boots crunching over the frozen snow. They swarmed the main house, a large, deeply weathered timber cabin with thick metal security bars bolted over every single window. The breachers placed a specialized explosive charge on the heavy wooden front door. With a deafening, blinding crack, the door was blown completely off its hinges, flying inward and smashing against the living room wall. The tactical officers rushed inside, their bright white weapons' lights cutting through the thick smoke and dust. They shouted deafening commands, clearing the kitchen, the hallway, and the bedrooms in a matter of seconds. Wallace Denton was sitting in a heavy leather armchair in the center of his dark living room. He was 62 years old, but his physical presence was still absolutely terrifying. He was a massive, towering giant of a man, his shoulders incredibly broad beneath a thick flannel shirt. He did not jump when the door was blown open. He didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't try to run. He simply sat in his chair, his heavy, scarred hands resting calmly on the armrests, staring at the heavily armed officers with a cold, utterly empty expression. Two massive SWAT officers immediately pulled Denton out of the chair, slamming him against the timber wall and securing his wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. Detective Sterling and Detective Jenkins stepped through the splintered doorway into the warm living room. Sterling looked up at the giant who had haunted his nightmares for 21 years. Denton looked down at the retired detective, a slow, deeply arrogant smirk spreading across his weathered face. "You boys are a long way from jurisdiction," Denton said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that sounded like grinding stones. "You're trespassing on private property." Sterling stepped closer, completely unfazed by the monster's size. "We found the VHS tape in the cabin wall, Wallace," Sterling said, his voice shaking with pure, unyielding fury. "We enhanced the video. We saw the parking permit hanging from your rearview mirror. It's over." Denton's arrogant smirk did not fade. He let out a dark, hollow chuckle. He knew the legal system perfectly. He knew that a blurry video of a truck and an old parking pass might secure a search warrant, but without a body, without a weapon, and without a confession, a murder conviction would be incredibly difficult to prove in court. Denton believed his secrets were permanently, safely buried under thousands of tons of solid rock. He simply closed his eyes, refusing to speak another word, completely confident that the earth would protect him. The police officers marched the giant out into the freezing blizzard, placing him into the back of a heavily armored transport vehicle. With the suspect secured, the massive forensic search of the compound began. The tactical teams tore the timber cabin apart, ripping up floorboards and emptying every single cabinet. The house was entirely clean. There were no photographs, no hidden trophies, and no weapons that matched the heavy steel wrench seen on the VHS tape. Jenkins walked out onto the snowy back porch, pulling her heavy winter coat tight against the biting wind. She looked across the sprawling, snow-covered backyard. About 50 yards away, sitting near the edge of a steep, rocky drop-off, was a massive, detached industrial steel barn. She called out to the subterranean tactical team. They marched across the freezing mud and used heavy bolt cutters to snap the thick steel padlocks on the barn doors. They pulled the heavy sliding doors open, aiming their flashlights into the pitch-black interior. The barn was massive, filled with old, rusting heavy mining equipment, massive stacks of timber and industrial barrels. But the highly trained subterranean officers immediately noticed that the center of the concrete floor was completely clear. Sitting perfectly flat in the center of the room was a massive, 10 by 10 foot solid steel plate, bolted into the foundation. The officers brought in heavy industrial plasma cutters. The blinding, Bright blue sparks showered across the dark barn as the intense heat sliced through the thick steel bolts securing the plate. Once the bolts were severed, they attached heavy steel chains to the plate and used a hydraulic winch on a tactical truck to slowly pull the massive slab backward. A rush of incredibly stale, freezing air blew up out of the floor, smelling of ancient stone, damp earth, and heavy iron rust. The steel plate had been covering a massive, modernized industrial freight elevator shaft that descended straight down into the absolute darkness of the earth. The thick steel cables suspending the elevator cage were heavily greased and completely free of rust. Wallace Denton had been actively maintaining this elevator. He had been making regular trips down into the dark. The subterranean SWAT team, equipped with heavy tactical helmets, thermal imaging cameras, and oxygen monitors, stepped onto the rusted metal grating of the elevator cage. Detective Sterling and Detective Jenkins insisted on going down with the first team. They locked the heavy metal gate and pressed the descent button on the control panel. The massive industrial motor groaned loudly, and the cage began to slowly drop into the vertical shaft. The descent was agonizingly slow and incredibly terrifying. The temperature dropped rapidly, the freezing air biting through their heavy winter coats. The bright white beams of their tactical flashlights illuminated the sheer, jagged rock walls passing by them. They descended for nearly 300 feet, traveling deep into the silent, suffocating belly of the mountain. Finally, the elevator hit the bottom of the shaft with a heavy, metallic clank. The tactical team raised their weapons and stepped out of the cage into a massive, cavernous underground tunnel. The sheer scale of the Pinecrest stone quarry was breathtaking and deeply horrifying. The tunnel was easily 40 feet wide and 30 feet tall, carved directly out of the solid gray granite. The officers moved in a tight, silent formation, their boots crunching against the loose gravel. They followed a thick, black electrical wire that Denton had strung along the ceiling, tracing it deep into the dark, echoing labyrinth. After walking for nearly half a mile through the winding, freezing tunnels, the electrical wire ended at a large, open subterranean cavern that had been converted into a horrifying, brightly lit staging area. The tactical officers fanned out, sweeping the massive room. It was not a prison cell. It was a meticulous, heavily organized, and utterly terrifying archive. Lining the jagged rock walls of the cavern were dozens of heavy metal shelving units, and resting on those shelves were hundreds of clear plastic storage bins. Jenkins walked over to the closest shelf, her breath plumbing in the freezing air. She shined her flashlight into the first plastic bin. It was filled with old, faded leather wallets. The bin next to it contained dozens of sets of car keys. Another bin held neatly folded, blood-stained winter coats. The horrifying truth of Wallace Denton's existence was completely exposed. He was not just the man who took Leo and Audrey Sullivan. He was one of the most prolific, highly organized, and completely undetected serial killers in the history of the United States. For decades, he had used his massive size, his dark utility truck, and the absolute isolation of the Colorado mountain highways to hunt stranded motorists, hikers, and tourists. He had dragged them down into his underground fortress, murdered them in the dark, and meticulously organized their belongings as sick, terrible trophies. Sterling felt a wave of absolute nausea wash over him as he stared at the endless rows of plastic bins, but he refused to lose focus. He was here for Leo and Audrey. He walked over to a heavy wooden workbench sitting in the center of the cavern. Resting on the desk was a large, hand-drawn map of the entire underground mine system. Wallace Denton had mapped every single tunnel, every deep shaft, and every dead end. Sterling scanned the map, his eyes searching for any marking that stood out. Near the very bottom edge of the massive paper, tracing a tunnel that led far away from the main staging area, Denton had drawn a heavy red circle. It was the exact same color of red marker he had used on Audrey's highway map 21 years ago. Written inside the red circle on the mind map were two words: The Drop. Sterling grabbed the map, signaling the tactical team to move. They left the brightly lit staging area and plunged back into the pitch-black, freezing labyrinth, following the hand-drawn lines on the paper. They walked for another agonizing mile, moving deeper and deeper into the most unstable, treacherous sections of the abandoned quarry. The air grew incredibly thin and heavy with stone dust. The wooden support beams lining the tunnel were severely warped and rotting under the unimaginable weight of the mountain above them. Finally, the tunnel came to an abrupt, massive dead end. But it was not a natural rock wall. It was a catastrophic, towering wall of collapsed gray granite boulders. A massive cave-in had completely sealed this section of the tunnel decades ago. Hundreds of tons of jagged rock completely blocked their path forward. Sterling stared at the collapsed wall, his heart sinking into his stomach. If Wallace Denton had thrown Leo and Audrey down into the dark cavern behind this cave-in, there was absolutely no way the tactical team could physically move the massive boulders without causing a secondary collapse that would kill them all. But the subterranean tactical unit was prepared for this exact scenario. The lead rescue technician stepped forward, carrying a heavy, specialized Pelican case. He opened the case, revealing a high-powered, industrial fiber-optic snake camera attached to a glowing digital monitor. The technician pulled a long, heavy masonry drill from his pack. The deafening, grinding roar of the drill echoed violently in the enclosed tunnel as the technician slowly, carefully bored a tiny, 2-inch hole straight through the gaps in the massive, collapsed boulders. It took nearly 30 minutes of agonizing, dust-choked labor to punch a clear path through the 15 feet of fallen rock. When the drill finally broke through into the empty space on the other side of the cave-in, the technician pulled the bit out and immediately inserted the long, flexible black cable of the fiber-optic camera into the hole. Sterling, Jenkins, and the tactical officers crowded around the small, glowing digital monitor, holding their collective breath. The technician slowly fed the camera cable through the rocks. The screen showed nothing but dark, gray stone passing by. Finally, the camera head dropped into the open, sealed cavern on the other side of the collapse. The technician switched on the incredibly bright, high-definition LED light attached to the camera lens. The bright white light cut through 21 years of absolute, undisturbed darkness. Sterling stared at the digital monitor, expecting to see a dark, muddy, horrifying grave. He expected to see the brutal, violent aftermath of a monster's cruelty. But as the tiny camera panned slowly across the sealed, freezing cavern, it illuminated a sight that completely stopped the hearts of every single heavily armed officer standing in the tunnel. It was not a chaotic, violent grave. It was a perfectly neat, meticulously organized, and heartbreakingly beautiful final campsite. The floor of the cavern had been swept completely clean of loose rocks. In the center of the room, a soft bed had been carefully constructed out of heavy, padded moss and folded clothing. And resting peacefully on the bed, perfectly preserved by the dry, freezing, oxygen-deprived air of the deep mine, were Leo and Audrey. They were not bound and they were not separated. They were lying side by side, holding each other tightly, resting with a profound, undeniable dignity. But as the camera panned slightly to the right, illuminating a large, flat gray stone positioned directly next to their final resting place, the true, history-altering miracle of the discovery was completely revealed. Resting perfectly flat on the stone, illuminated brilliantly in the LED light, was the large paper highway map they had purchased at the gas station. And surrounding the map, meticulously carved directly into the hard granite wall of the cavern using a heavy iron railroad spike, was a massive, sprawling, beautifully handwritten message that would change absolutely everything. The bright LED light of the fiber-optic camera illuminated the carved granite wall, casting sharp, deep shadows into the meticulously written letters. Detective Sterling and Detective Jenkins leaned closer to the small digital monitor, their eyes tracking the words that Leo and Audrey had left behind in the absolute silence of the earth. It was not a message of panic. It was a clear, calm, and devastating chronicle of their final days. The handwriting on the wall was a mixture of Leo's block text and Audrey's beautiful, looping script. The text revealed that they had survived inside the sealed cavern for nearly 2 weeks after Wallace Denton threw them down into the dark. The giant had mistakenly believed that throwing them into an abandoned, unstable mining shaft would guarantee they died instantly. But the young couple had miraculously survived the fall with only minor injuries. They had quickly realized that the main exit was permanently blocked by the massive cave-in. But instead of giving in to despair, they spent their final days working together to ensure the monster would eventually be caught. Leo had used his mechanical knowledge to thoroughly map the orientation of the shafts from memory, documenting the exact layout of the Pinecrest Quarry property on the back of their highway map. Audrey had used the iron spike to carve their full timeline, the physical description of the tall man who ambushed them, and the specific details of his dark utility trucked directly into the granite wall. They had spent their remaining oxygen turning their final resting place into a bulletproof legal trap. The final lines of the carving were written by Audrey. They carried an overwhelming, heartbreaking emotional weight that brought both detectives to tears. "We know they will find this place someday," the script read. "We have water from the stone and we have each other. We are not afraid. Tell my mother that we fell asleep in each other's arms and that the love she gave me was enough to light up the dark. We love you, Mom. We are finally safe." Sterling wiped the tears from his eyes, his voice thick with 21 years of released sorrow. The Newlyweds had not died as helpless victims. They had died as heroes, completely outsmarting their killer from beyond the grave. They had preserved the evidence, left a flawless record of the crime, and reclaims their own dignity in a way that Wallace Denton could never touch. The extraction process took nearly 24 hours of painstaking, deeply respectful labor. The subterranean rescue unit used specialized tools to carefully expand the drill hole, creating a secure opening through the collapsed boulders without disturbing the structural integrity of the cavern. Detective Sterling personally helped lift the remains of Leo and Audrey out of the dark, shielding them with heavy velvet sheets as they were brought up the industrial elevator shaft into the blinding white light of the Colorado morning. While the forensic team transported the victims and the historic carved map to the state coroner's office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation launched a massive, unprecedented operation to process the rest of the underground mine. The staging area, with its hundreds of plastic storage bins, opened up a terrifying window into decades of unsolved cold cases across the country. Federal analysts spent months cross-referencing the wallets, keys, and jewelry found on the shelves with national missing person databases. Wallace Denton's hidden archive ultimately provided answers, closure, and justice for over 30 different families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones along the isolated mountain highways. The subsequent legal battle was short, sharp, and completely devastating for the defense. The district attorney presented the jury with a mountain of undeniable physical proof. They played the structural audio from the VHS tape, showing the exact moment Denton pushed the seat back and staged the decoy map. They presented the stabilized still frame of his quarry gate pass hanging from the rearview mirror. And finally, they brought the high-definition photographs of the carved granite wall directly into the courtroom. The victim's own words, perfectly recorded in stone, left the defense with absolutely no room to move. Recognizing that he was facing the death penalty and that his meticulously hidden life had been completely dismantled, Wallace Denton finally broke his silence. He signed a full confession, admitting to the abductions, the extortion, and the murders of Leo, Audrey, and dozens of others. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the absolute possibility of parole. He was transferred to a maximum security federal penitentiary, destined to spend the remainder of his natural life locked in a small, windowless concrete cell. A fitting punishment for a man who had tried to bury his sins in the darkness of the earth. For Patricia, the delivery of the truth was a moment of profound, world-altering emotional collapse. When Detective Sterling and Detective Jenkins walked into her Denver home, carrying the original silver wedding rings that had been recovered from the cavern, Patricia fell to her knees. She held the small metal bands against her chest and wept, a loud, raw, and agonizing release of 21 years of suffocating grief. The torturous limbo of the unknown was finally gone. The nightmare of wondering if her daughter was cold, hungry, or running away had ended. She finally had the absolute truth, and she had her children back. On a bright, crisp afternoon in early December, the city of Denver gathered to lay Leo and Audrey Sullivan to rest. The funeral was a massive, incredibly beautiful tribute to their lives and their love. Hundreds of people, family members, childhood friends, retired teachers, and the police officers who had never given up on the case, filled the church benches. Leo and Audrey were buried side by side in a quiet, sunlit plot beneath a massive oak tree. The golden autumn leaves had all fallen, covering the grass in a warm, protective blanket of orange and brown. Patricia stood by the beautiful marble headstone, flanked by Detective Sterling and Detective Jenkins, who stood respectfully by her side. As the caskets were slowly lowered into the earth, Patricia placed a single, perfect white rose on each lid. For the first time in over 2 decades, she felt the crushing, suffocating weight lift from her soul. She smiled through her tears, knowing exactly where her daughter was. Leo and Audrey were no longer lost in the dark corners of a cold mountain mine. They were resting together in the light, permanently safe from the monsters of the world. The following week, Patricia walked out onto her front porch. The afternoon air was freezing, but the sky was a brilliant, clear shade of blue. She reached up to the porch light fixture, turned the glowing glass bulb, and switched it off for the very first time since 1994. The long night was finally over, and the light was no longer needed to guide a ghost home. The story of the newlyweds who vanished on their road trip became a legendary case study in the history of American law enforcement. It stood as a dark, chilling reminder that absolute evil can hide behind normal routines, using the quiet isolation of the wilderness to mask its cruelty. But far more importantly, it remains an immortal, unbreakable testament to the enduring nature of truth and love. A monster can spend years planning the perfect crime. He can build a fortress. He can bury the evidence under hundreds of tons of solid stone, and he can manipulate the world into looking the wrong way for over 2 decades. He can check the camera, press the buttons, and believe he has permanently silenced the witnesses. But the truth is a patient, living thing. It waits in the magnetic tape of an old video cassette, it hides in the plaster of a rotting cabin wall, and it stays perfectly preserved in the carvings of a silent granite cavern. Time has a way of shattering even the heaviest concrete vaults, proving that no matter how deep you bury a secret, and no matter how many years pass, the light will always find a way to break through the dark, completely destroying the silence and finally bringing the lost ones home.